creating and sustaining 3.5 million job opportunities, tracking the high cost of living, investing in infrastructure, and of course transforming the economy. These are some of the ANC's 2024 Election Manifesto priorities promised by the governing party for the next 5 years. Now, the party also says that in the past 5 years, 1.5 trillion rand was raised in new investment commitments, of which over 500 billion rand has already flowed into the economy. So to take a closer look at the ANC's 2024 Election Manifesto and the political party's progress over the past 30 years, we joined virtually now by Dr Oscar van Heerden, a Senior Research Fellow at African Diplomacy and International Relations at the University of Johannesburg. Dr van Heerden, good morning, and thanks so much for speaking to us here on Morning Live.
Good morning, Sakina, and good morning to the viewers.
So let's just start with a quick comparison, looking at the big three. How do you think the 2024 ANC manifesto compared to the ones presented by the DA and the EFF recently?
Look, manifestos are all about making promises. As to whether you live up to those promises and deliver, that's, of course, the big issue. But I do think that, first, let me say that the EFF manifesto, as the third or the second largest opposition party, was full of opportunistic statements, if I can put it like that. Anyone who really listened and took it in will know that it made in some instances very ridiculous promises. And then, of course, when we look at the DA, a little bit more realistic, making promises that it will deliver on a number of fronts. But again, the ANC is also making huge promises. 3.5 million jobs. Or job opportunities, I should say. Perhaps a target that can be attained. The president certainly has, in terms of its job opportunities in previous years, they have created about 1 million of those opportunities. But 3.5 is a stretch. We'll have to see whether they can live up to it.
So when we're talking about attainable, realistic and unrealistic, let's look at some examples from those manifestos. When you say the EFF, were unrealistic, give us an example. What's more achievable from the DA manifesto? And of course, these opportunities, job opportunities, as opposed to actual sustainable long-term jobs. Let's also just unpack that.
Yeah, no, look, the issue for me with the EFF is playing the race card, for example, is just unrealistic. We've moved quite a distance from the days of apartheid. To talk about, whites being targeted and them being the enemy, so to speak, it's taking us backwards. Quite honestly, and I think that Julius and his team knows that is just not helpful in the current context in South Africa. With the DA, we talk about, for example, things like always claiming that they run a clean and efficient machine in terms of governance and so forth, and yet we see that the city of Tshwane is lying in ruins, quite frankly. It's in serious debt. Debt is increasing. We've had cases of cholera and other things. And so, to make these promises, you need to live up to it, including the ANC, by the way, because the ANC also claims that it is going to create all these job opportunities when, in fact, the reality in terms of structurally is that they need to create meaningful jobs. They need to transform the economy in order for young people to actually get employment and restore their dignity. And so these manifestos are all very, very hyped with promises, but the proof is in the pudding, Sakina, and we'll have to see who can deliver on it.
So if we look at the fact that the EFF, the ANC and the IFP, all three will be delivering their manifestos at the Moses Mabhida Stadium 2 have already done so. The IFP is still to come. And if we look at what Mbazima Shilowa calls stadiumology, the attendance of supporters at that Moses Mabhida Stadium on Saturday with the ANC, they filled it to the brim. The EFF not as much. President Cyril Ramaphosa's message, a reflection on the popularity of the electorate going into the elections. Is there much that we can read into that?
This is just the politics of perception, Sakina. Whether you fill the stadium or you don't fill the stadium, that's not really an indication of how you will fare in the elections. I think that point must be made. Of course, with ANC events, the ANC is very popular. Let's start there. There was no doubt that they would fill the stadium to the brim, but I don't think we must take that as an indication that they are going to necessarily perform well in the elections. Similarly with the EFF, I saw the stadium; it wasn't that full. But the truth of the matter is that they are still the second largest opposition party, and there is a strong possibility that if the young voters turn up, they might actually become the official opposition party, taking that crown away from the DA. But as I say, we'll have to see with the outcome of the elections.
And we've heard the political parties, the DA in particular, disputing, for example, the latest Ipsos poll, and that poll, of course, showing support for the ANC, predicted to be well below 50%. The multi-party charter looking to draw about 33% of the vote, according to that poll at this stage. But should this happen, where are the more likely coalition agreements to be struck? Because if you look at the ANC and EFF post-elections, the EFF have told us they don't do coalitions. They have arrangements. They decide who to vote with on whichever issue. So that's obviously going to be quite interesting to see where the horse trading happens.
Sakina, all this talk about we're not going to do this and we're not going to do that and we will do that, it's all, in my opinion, it means nothing, because once the result is now presented and we know who got what percentage and so forth, it completely changes the whole game. Even those that say we'll never do this and we'll never do that, they will have to come back to their senses and say, if we get into an alliance with the ANC or with the EFF or whatever the case might be, then we will actually be in charge of this province or that municipality, So I don't invest too much in these statements about we'll never do this and we'll never do that, because at the end of the day, you go into a coalition that makes sense. And if it means that you are going to be in charge, if it means you're going to have power, then that's what you are going to do, because that's what your electorate wants. So I think people will reevaluate their positions after the outcome and after the results are known. So that's the first thing. The second thing is, I think, the issue about we hate the ANC. I think that is a very unfortunate approach to politics, because at the end of the day, the ANC is the ruling party, it's the majority party, it's likely to get the majority of the vote, even if it is under 50%, which I don't think is going to be the case. You need to be able to deal with that governing party. You need to take them into cognizance. And I think this attitude that we will never go into a coalition with the ANC, or we will never do this and that with the ANC, I think it's very unfortunate. And I think the electorate is reading into that. It's a very dangerous approach to politics, and that needs to change, I think. And quite honestly, Sakina, I think that the ANC is likely, with all the polls, I think the ANC is likely to get 53, 54%.
And what would you base that on, Dr. van Heerden? What do you think is going to push them to that level?
If you look at the past elections, it's now known, it's common knowledge that the ANC has been shedding about 4% in each general election. From the time it had 67% under the Thabo Mbeki administration, it's just sort of slowly lost 4% every 5 years, and I see no reason why that trend is not going to continue. At the moment, the ANC is sitting at 57.5%. I think if you take away about 4%, as has been the trend, then you're looking at 53.5, 54%.
Dr. van Heerden, just coming back to the election manifesto and the ANC manifesto focusing on 6 priorities for the next 5 years. And interesting, but I suppose not surprisingly, is that for all of the parties so far, the jobs issue is, of course, of concern. So the first priority for the ANC is, of course, putting South Africans to work. And they talk there about these job opportunities, increase in small enterprises, etc. But, of course, how do you do all of this if you are not addressing the now colossus in the room, which is Eskom? And I thought it was very interesting that the president didn't really spend time on that at all. So how are we going to create these industries? How are we going to achieve these jobs without stable electricity supply?
Yes, no, you're absolutely right. There was one sentence in the entire manifesto that spoke about energy. I think the president is trying to give the impression that it's not something that is a huge, colossal problem, that the Minister of Electricity is dealing with it, and that there are plans afoot in terms of the private sector and so forth that to address this issue. I think that was a mistake. It is, of course, affecting ordinary South Africans. It is completely necessary to be able to create jobs, to drive the economy and so forth. I think the ANC is aware of this, and they are having feet on the ground, as they say, to try and deal with it. But you're right, Sakina, it is about jobs, jobs and jobs. And all the manifestos talk about this thing. We have huge numbers, 4.9 million young people between the ages of 18 and 35 that are unemployed. And also not getting any form of training, education, etc. This is a huge crisis. And unless we get unless we get the electricity situation right, we are actually we're going to do a disservice to those youngsters.
But how do we get this electricity situation right, and also looking at government's approach to it? You have, for example, in China, where they had some blackouts in 2021, and they were very decisive in how they addressed that matter. They went on to look at new energy supply in terms of renewables, but they also were unapologetic about, using coal and fossil fuels in order to stabilize that grid. And it didn't matter what the other countries or other interest groups were saying. China did what they had to do for China. So how come we are unable to do such? Because we are mineral rich in that regard. We have the coal that we are, by the way, exporting to the likes of China. Why can't we be decisive about dealing with our energy crisis?
No, one of the big problems, Sakina, is, and you're right, it is about decisive leadership, and I think Ramaphosa does bring that to the table. But one of the big problems with South Africa is that it's also about infrastructure. We have the coal, no doubt, but do we have the actual power stations to run the coal? That is the issue. We have 3 power stations that are running on diesel, and that comes into effect when there is heavy pressure on the grid. They are now being converted into gas because gas is cheaper, and I think that is the right move. But it is about a question of infrastructure, and not so much that we don't have the actual minerals and the coal to run the power stations. There's been situations where certain power stations have been mothballed, have been decommissioned. Those are now being reopened, coming back on stream. And then, of course, there's also your green and your alternatives. And the private sector is playing their part. They're bringing in solar and wind in particular. And that's also a good thing. So I do think, in as much as electricity crisis is top of mind at this point in time, in this election, I don't think it's going to be for the next election. I do think that the government is beginning, together with the private sector, of course, they are beginning to get control of it.
Well, Dr. van Heerden, unfortunately, we are going to have to leave it there. And interesting, but it remains to be seen. We still have the Freedom Front Plus. They will be delivering their manifesto this coming weekend, followed by Inkatha Freedom Party the next weekend, and that would conclude the top 5 from the last election. But of course, we'll wait to see what happens and ultimately who gets to deliver and how much they get to deliver on these election manifestos. But Dr. Oscar van Heerden, thank you so much, Senior Research Fellow for African Diplomacy and International Relations at the University of Johannesburg, giving us his analysis on the ANC's 2024 election manifesto.